Good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted this morning to introduce to you a living legend. You don't get to say that too often, someone that's a living legend in the technology industry. So we're here today with Steve Wozniak, and Steve is the co-founder of Apple Computer, and he is actually, I would say, the pioneer of the personal computing industry. Think about it. Without Steve, there would be no Apple. Your iPhone, your iPad, your Mac, all of these things wouldn't exist. How about that? That'd be a very, very different existence today. Now, Steve is probably one of the most famous engineers in the world. He's also a noted philanthropist, and he has a huge passion for education, as you're going to hear throughout this conversation. And he's been awarded some of the most prestigious awards in technology and innovation, including the Grace Hopper Award, the National Medal of Technology from President Reagan with Steve Jobs. And that was for single-handedly designing the first personal computer. Imagine our lives without the first computer, without a personal computer. The Heinz Award for Technology, the Economy and Employment, the Hoover Medal, the Isaac Asimov Science Award, as well as countless honorary degrees from all around the world. And in September 2000, Steve was inducted into the National Innovators Hall of Fame. He's also, as you're going to see in this conversation, I have no idea where this conversation is going to go. He's a notorious practical joker, and he's been known for using pseudonyms such as, I'll pronounce this incorrectly, Evets Kainzau, which is Steve Wozniak backwards, and he used that so that he could actually get his Tetris high score in Nintendo magazine, because he didn't believe they'd print out Steve Wozniak. He also, and I think this is really, really impressive, he has a diploma from Berkeley University, and it's not in the name Steve Wozniak, it's in the name of Rocky Raccoon Clark. So ladies and gentlemen, I have no idea this is going to go. Please join me in welcoming Steve Wozniak. Hey, Steve. So, Steve, thanks very much for doing this. I'm guessing everyone in the room and everyone viewing in knows you pretty well, but for those that don't, those that have been living under a rock for the last 40 years, tell them a little bit about your background, how you got into technology, and how you eventually went to co-found Apple Computer.
Yeah, well, I got into technology for the fun of it. I got into the old analog electronics and the early digital stuff back when it wasn't around. It didn't exist. There were no books in bookstores. I would stumble into a little article or a book, and I'd read something and get inspired and want to do it. Got a ham radio license by the time I was 10 years old. You had to study a lot of mathematics and formulas of how electrons flow through devices to do that, and build your own ham radio in those days. Every single part, screw it together and make dials that would turn, transmitter, receiver. So that was it, and discovered computer stuff. Well, computer stuff was never going to be a job. It was never going to be a career, never going to be money. You didn't get a grade. There was nobody else in school that knew this stuff. And I studied it on paper, playing with these zeros and ones. And I said, this is fascinating. I love how computer stuff, logic, digital logic can make little decisions. And then I built huge science fair projects with hundreds of pieces. I was a builder. I didn't sit back and do a little weekend project with a few parts. Hundreds of electronic pieces all connected together to play tic-tac-toe in 6th grade and 8th grade. It would add numbers in 1 and 0 computer style, and switches and lights and all that stuff. Didn't ever think it would be a job or an occupation. I was going to be an engineer. I told my dad, going to be an engineer, and engineers make TVs and radios. And second, I told him I wanted to be a 5th grade teacher. And it's little known because I didn't allow press in, but I taught 5th through 9th graders for 8 years of my life in the local public schools. No press allowed. So anyway, I got into this digital stuff. Anyway, by high school, I had trained myself with no books. There were no books. It wasn't like you had a university to go by. And I knew logic could make little decisions and OR gates, they're called, like switches on the wall. And if you have 1,000 switches, you can make something important that seems to really do something. And I taught myself how to design computers. Don't ask me how you do that without a book. I had a description of a computer that existed. It's little holding places for numbers, and I had to design with these little logic circuits that in 6th grade, I put a bunch of them together and it would play tic-tac-toe and never lose. And I figured out on paper after months of trying. It wasn't easy. A lot of work, but it was my passion in life. I figured out how to design a computer. Oh my gosh, this was great. I could never afford one chip, so I would never own a computer. And I told my dad in high school, someday I'm going to own a 4K computer. I'm going to buy a 4K computer. He said it costs as much as a house. And I was stunned, so I said, I'll live in an apartment. I was going to have a computer in my life because I knew how to use them, whether or not it could do anything useful or be worth any money or anything. I was going to have it, so that was basically how I got into electronics.
And then obviously you got
And then,
to know.
oh yeah, then through life, I followed my passion into college. When I went to college, my freshman year, and I could have gone to, MIT or something. I had 800s on all the math and science SATs, and I could design any computer in the world in 2 days by then. I practiced over and over and over. Went off to a college where it snowed, and I followed my heart. I loved the snow. I loved it. We've never had that in my life. And Introduction to Computers was a graduate course. I took it, and I got an A+. And I wrote all the programs I could and got in trouble and ran the class 5 times over budget, a ton of money, like $50,000 today. So I'm progressing through college, also taking engineering courses. And after my second year of college, I did not want to burden my parents with the cost of college. So I took a year off and I got a job programming a computer. And it was great. And one of the executives helped me get some parts to build a little computer of my own design because I could never afford the chips. The executive got me the chips, designed that computer, built it, and while I was building it, I met Steve Jobs because he was in the same high school I'd gone to, and he understood electronics, and he liked playing pranks. Now, I got it, somewhere along the line, my career's going up and up and up, developing products that were going to head straight for the Apple II computer. I got a job, I worked at Hewlett-Packard. This was the amazing thing. After my third year of college, taking only graduate courses in hardware and software design, I got out and I wanted to work another year to earn the money for my fourth year of college, so as not to burden my parents. And somehow I stumbled into designing the hottest product of the day. Like today, you might say the latest smartphone is one of the hottest products. Back then, it was the Hewlett-Packard handheld scientific calculator, the HP 35. They brought me in, interviewed me, and I didn't have a college degree, but they hired me on the spot to be an engineer designing this great product. And while I worked at Hewlett-Packard for a few years, it's like I kept inventing things on my own just for fun, building things, and I would take jobs around California. We had no movies in hotels. A guy from Hollywood came up, and he had VCRs, and he wanted me to design a system. I got to design the first system for hotels and movies. I got to design it. Wow. And I charged 5 cents for that design. It's like when I do things for fun, I don't feel like charging for money. In college, I would type, I loved typing, so I would type term papers for other people from midnight till 6 in the morning, and I would charge them 5 cents to prove that I loved doing it. So I did project after project after project while I worked at HP on the outside. I walked in a bowling alley and I got inspired by the Pong game. Oh my God, I said, you can use a TV set for an output device, because output device cost more than the computers. Oh my gosh, what an idea. So I went home and I developed 28 little $1 chips into a working Pong game. Took it into work and showed it off at Hewlett-Packard, and then Steve Jobs came into town. About once a year, he would come into town, come visit me and see what I had, and he'd always find a way to turn it into money. So he took my Pong game down to Atari, and I think they thought he designed it or something, and gave him a job there. And then I got to, but we're heading towards the personal computer. Okay, so we've got a little black and white game called Pong, and then I got a job for Atari designing a game called Breakout, where you have a paddle, and you hit the ball, and it bounces off bricks, and it knocks out bricks, and breaks through the wall. I designed that. And it was very tough to do because it was in the day of hardware design games. Every game, Atari was starting a new business called arcade games. And the arcade games were all hardware designs. That means a talented engineer like myself would spend a year designing a prototype game. And I had to do this one in 4 days and nights. I didn't know if I could do it. I was the hottest designer ever, but I didn't know if I could do it, and I did it. 4 days and nights, no sleep. Steve Jobs and myself both got mononucleosis the sleeping sickness and delivered a working breakout to Atari. But now I've got games that I've designed where you can put balls and paddles on your TV. Then the next step along, I was doing other projects, but I saw a friend of mine on the ARPANET. The ARPANET was long before today's internet. There were only 6 computers in the United States on the ARPANET. And you could type commands and log into any of the 6 and see files and play games and run programs. And that was cool. Well, MIT, UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, Stanford Research. So there were 6 of them. And I had to have that. Oh my gosh, I gotta have that. And I realized I could design anything these days for very low cost. I'd been designing so much of my life, always heading towards the fewest parts and the lowest cost, so I built myself a terminal. And in my terminal, I could type on a keyboard, which was the most expensive thing I ever bought on the way to Apple. $60 for a keyboard in those days. It's hundreds of dollars today. And I would type on the keyboard to a computer out in Boston, and that over a phone line. And over the phone line, the computer would send tones back, and it would make characters on my TV set. I could talk to a faraway computer. Wow, that was exciting. And Steve Jobs turned that one into money too. He sold it as a cheap terminal to a local time-sharing outfit. But Steve was up in Oregon. I had to do the breakout game for Atari in 4 days and nights because Steve needed money to move into a commune up in Oregon where he lived with other people and farmed orchards or whatever. So he's up in Oregon, and the Homebrew Computer Club started up. Homebrew Computer Club, maybe about 250 people of us at the most, and nobody who kind of had wherewithal, nobody who was company executives and businessmen. It was just people who believed that with the microprocessor, we were going to have computers that people could afford to have their own computer. And Stanford professors would tell us, oh my gosh, we're going to have better communication. You'll be able to type a message into a big computer somewhere, and within 1 hour, 100 people will be able to read your message. Wow. You know, and education, kids were going to use 100% of their neurons instead of only 10% once they had computers. And I remember sitting in my seat getting scared because in about 3 years, I'm going to be out of business. All these smart kids, all these young kids are going to be doing more than me. And this social revolution, and what's my talent? My talent is making computers. So I took my little terminal that could talk to a faraway computer. I realized that summer, prices of the brains, the microprocessors, I got one for $20. Prices of the right kind of memory, a difficult to use memory, you had to be an engineer. Everybody else trying to start small computers up didn't use the right kind of memory. They used the super expensive static memory because it was in Intel data sheets. They weren't designers, they weren't creators of their own stuff. So I put the right memory and the right microprocessor, that was the brains, and I put it on my terminal. Now I could type on a keyboard to my own computer, and my own computer could type to my TV set. Wow, that was amazing. And I took it down every 2 weeks and showed it off at the computer club, and I was a hero. Don't believe a movie with Ashton Kutcher that shows Steve Jobs dragging me, I don't know anything, to a club. Steve had never been to the club. He came into town, and I said, you've got to come down and see the excitement here. And I took him down, I took my TV and my board and my keyboard, and I typed on it, and the computer's doing stuff, and the crowd is all around us. And that's when Steve said, let's start a company.
And any concerns? You were in HP at the time. Was
I
it like hold your nose
HP.
and jump in, or did you?
I was in HP, and I was doing all these little projects and design stuff on my own. They weren't HP projects, and I was doing them on my own in my HP cubicle, which is really interesting. This is little known. Our calculator division in HP was the only division of Hewlett-Packard that was making money in 1973. Because of a recession, every other division was losing money. But our calculator division was doing so good, the whole company was positive. The 2 buildings for our calculator division are in a big part of land where Apple recently bought out a Hewlett-Packard division, but they bought some extra land that had our 2 buildings, which is where the Apples were designed. Anyway, I'm showing this thing off at the club, and Steve sees the excitement, and he said, we should start a company. And not to build a computer. Steve wasn't into this, here's what a computer should be and do for people, and here's what it does for society. He was not like that at all. That's a little mistaken impression. I was telling him how important they would be and how great they would be. And when it finally came time and we were going to build the Apple I computer, I pleaded with him for 2 hours to please give the first Apple I computer to this woman that would take it into elementary schools for young kids to discover what computers were about. I felt that was so important because I'd lucked into that myself, and Steve wouldn't do it, so he made me buy the computer for $300 and the Apple I, and I gave it to that woman to take in. But at first, in starting the company, I said, wait a minute. I'm going to be an engineer for life. I was never going to move up an org chart. I knew what I was really superb at, better than almost any other person alive, and it was a type of digital engineering. I'm going to be an engineer at Hewlett-Packard for the rest of my life because you're allowed to be an engineer there. We make the products that engineers use to test their own stuff and develop their own stuff. It was a total engineer company, and I believed in engineers. So I proposed it. Steve didn't have any panic. Steve said, oh yeah, okay. I said, I'd have to propose it to Hewlett-Packard first. Steve was okay with that, and I proposed it to my group leader and the section manager and the lab manager and some marketing guys, and they turned me down for the first of 5 times for that personal computer idea. Hewlett-Packard turned it down, so Steve and I had to start a company with no money. We had no bank accounts, we had no rich relatives, the idea that Steve came up with was not to build a computer. He had been selling parts all his life. He worked in surplus electronics stores, and he knew how to spot something and turn it into money. He was a good talker, and he knew how he could convince people that they had a need and they would use something. So every time he came into town and got something I had designed lately, he turned it into money. This was another one. We were going to build what's called a PC board for $20, and I had given away my design for free anyway. Before Steve even knew the computer existed, I'd given away the design to people at the club. I said, build your own. I helped some of them build their own. So it's public domain. But Steve said, we'll get this board for $20 and we'll sell it for $40, and then they can get chips and plug them in and wire it up a lot faster than building the whole computer from scratch. And we'd have to sell the amount of money we'd have to put in. We didn't have any money. I'd have to sell my most valuable possession, my Hewlett-Packard 65 calculator, and we'd put in the amount of money, and we'd have to sell 50 boards to break even. And I didn't know if we'd do it, and Steve said, yeah, but we'll have a company for once in our lives. We'd been selling my stuff for 5 years, so this was a good union. And we started a little partnership, the first start of Apple. Apple had 2 starts. It's not the Apple you know today. Little thing, and we had a third partner who we gave 10% of the company to, and Steve would have 45%, and I would have 45%, and he typed up a business agreement, a partnership agreement, and that was where, having no money, we had to work out of the house. Now, very quickly, after we had this PC board that we would sell for $40, the local store guy, Paul Terrell, he'd seen me operate the computer at the club. He knew this was the one, and he wanted to buy them completely assembled, 100 computers for $50,000. That was the biggest financial shock ever in Apple history. When Steve called and told me that, thank God I was sitting on a chair at my lab school at Hewlett-Packard. So now we had a $50,000 order, but we have no money. We got the parts on credit. We had 30 days to pay for the parts. We'd build them up, and the store owner agreed to pay us cash every time we built one of these computer boards called the Apple I. Now, we had a garage, but it wasn't a company. It didn't have like desks and people and books and phones. It didn't have any of that. We never once discussed a new product in a garage. We never did any engineering or design or prototyping in a garage. We never did manufacturing in a garage. About once a week, we'd have to pick up some computers that had been built at a place for us in Santa Clara. Steve would drive them to the house at first, and then the garage. You got to move off the kitchen table. So we're in the garage, and I would test each board, and we'd get them good and take them to the store, drive them to the store, and get paid cash. We only used the garage a few hours a week, and almost never more than 1 or 2 people in it. There was like no company, but Steve did all the business work there. He had the phone. He stretched a long line out from his bedroom so he could order parts, and he could get sales, and he could talk to the press, and so he did all the business ends that are very important for that product. But before we ever shipped this little computer, the Apple I, you would type on it, and text would appear on your screen. And if a computer talked back to you, the text would come out, only about 1 line a second. It was kind of slow. Why was it slow? I had not designed it to be a computer. I had designed it to be a computer, a terminal that works over the internet, over the modem to the ARPANET, 6 computers in the world. And I designed it to be that, and it was designed for the lowest cost parts for the speed that a modem could go. So it wasn't that great a computer, but before we ever shipped one of these Apple I's, I had the real winner, the Apple II computer. And one of the big things on that was color. All of the arcade industry at that point in time, the games were hardware designs. As I said before, a skilled engineer would take a year to create a prototype of a new game. They were not software where you could sit down and program a new game in a week or a day. They were hardware. They were also black and white. Nobody had solved the color problem. Color cost a lot of money. Color TVs cost a lot of money. And that was one thing. When I was working at Atari, 4 days and nights, your mind drifts when you haven't had sleep. It just drifts into fancy places. And I thought I saw some color on a TV at Atari in the manufacturing, the back room, and where I'd learned to play the games and all that. I thought I saw color. And my head went back to I could repair color TVs. Went back to color. If you had a nice little wave on a wire, a wave at the exact right speed, called the color subcarrier frequency, the exact right up and down speed, every color TV would think it was color. Maybe it was red. It came a little later in time, it was blue. And if it was higher, it might be whiter and darker. If it's lower, darker. Oh my gosh. What popped in my head right then was, that cost 5,000 of today's dollars to build. That device, differential calculus, heavy mathematics, expensive parts to twiddle it up and make these little waves and mix red and blue and green and get color on a TV cost $5,000. What popped in my head was, oh my gosh, in the digital world, with no chips at all, we have a number. And a number like 3 is made up of zeros and ones. 3 is 0, 0, 1, 1. Well, if you put zeros and ones on a wire, zeros are like down and ones are up. And go 0, 0, down, 1, 1 up, 0, 0, down, 1, 1 up. It's not a smooth wave, but when you put something into a TV set, it has what's called a low frequency filter going in. It automatically rounds off that square wave. It makes it look like a normal wave that could be, if it's coming at the right speed, every TV would think it was color. You can see how different this was than anything ever in any engineering book. Color TV did not work this way. Popped that idea in my head, put it into the Apple II computer, knowing it would work. And I just designed and optimized and saved parts and cut them down. I designed the computer. At first, I told Steve Jobs I was going to try to use that technique to make our Apple I color. But I started adding chips and chips and chips and chips, and I don't like things with a lot of parts, even if they only cost $1 each. I don't like it. I want to make things so simple, so I went back to the ground and I designed a color TV timing at the basis of it. And it took about 7 chips to control the RAMs, and then I got it down to 5 chips. I came up with a method called a state machine, got it down to 2.5 chips, and I worked and worked and went through manuals, and I found a chip that could be set up a certain way for 1.25 chips. It's $1.25. I could generate all the timing for color TV and all the timing that controlled the memories, the dynamic memories, and I just optimized this thing down to almost no parts, half the parts of an Apple I, and it was the first time ever that arcade games were computerized. They were programs and they were color. First time ever arcade games were color, first time ever they were software. Okay, I sat down, once I had this thing, I could type a number in a memory somewhere and a dot would pop up, a red dot on my TV, type another number in and a blue dot would pop up. And then I had written my own programming language for this computer, so I added commands that could set the color and plot a point or draw a horizontal line or draw a vertical line. And I sat down to write my game Breakout in color on an Apple II computer in software. For the first time ever, a game was written in software in a simple programming language called BASIC that 9-year-olds can use. And I wrote it in half an hour. I had tried so many variations of colors of bricks, speed of the ball, angle of the ball, how the score was, how it was. I had tried that many variations. It would have taken me 10 years to do it the old hardware way. So I called Steve Jobs over to my apartment and sitting down on the floor with wires sneaking into the back of my TV, showed him all the little changes, how easy it was to change the game. And we were both quivering because we knew the world would never be the same now that games were software. Who was going to buy a $2,000 computer to calculate inventory or sales figures or salaries in their home. You don't do that in a home. What computers have been used for before didn't apply to the home. They had to play games. They had to be fun machines. This was the key. Had to be games. So that was a huge start. And we had this Apple II computer before we ever shipped an Apple I computer. The Apple II was up and being demonstrated. I remember one of our first demos ever. Steve and I flew just kind of about our first time ever out of California. We flew to Atlantic City for a little show called PC 76. A bunch of little two young people, just out of high school or college, two young people in every company that had a little, trying to get into microcomputers with switches and lights and all that the old computer style stuff, but they were trying to make them affordable with microprocessors. They were all there. And our computer, the Apple I, was being shown. It was so much ahead of the others. But we had the Apple II, but we didn't want to let anybody see this machine with color. We knew that this one wasn't going to be given away for free. This one was going to be the start of a big company. So we went down late at night when everyone was gone, except one guy that had a projector TV. I wanted to see my color circuit work on a projector TV. And we hooked it in and we projected it and made some dots on the screen, made things move around in colors. The guy running the projector was seeing all of the little low-cost startup attempts in the world, and he said, "This is the one I want." And we knew we had the good one.
That took off like wildfire, and the company grew.
The next step, problem is it was too good. This computer was so good, we had no money. When you have no money, how do you build 1,000 computers? It is impossible. So Steve Jobs, being the businessman, started looking for money, different angles, and wound up with an angel, Mike Markkula, was willing to fund enough money to build 1,000 computers, $250,000 way back then. And he felt this was the winner, and this was going to be a huge market, and it was the opportunity for a company to start up and lead the market and become a billion-dollar company in 5 years. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's had a lot of success. He retired from Intel on a stock option. He invests money. He's a smart guy. The more success you've had in life, the bigger a number you're allowed to talk. $1 billion, that's ridiculous. $1 million would be huge. That was my thinking. So he was willing to invest, but he said I had to leave Hewlett-Packard. My love and my loyalty for that company, I can't tell you how strong it was. And I was going to be an engineer there for the rest of my life, so he gave me until Tuesday to decide. So Tuesday I met Mike Markkula and Steve Jobs in Mike's Campagna, and I said, I'd gone inside myself. I'd asked myself questions, I'd explored what I want in life, and I was not going to start Apple. This product was not going to Apple because I wanted to work at Hewlett-Packard for the rest of my life. Mike Markkula said I'd have to leave Hewlett-Packard. I'd wanted to work there for the rest of my life, and I love designing computers. I could do that with a company called Apple, but I could do that on my own time. I'd designed 2 computers in a year, and written a programming language and designed all sorts of other things like mass storage for it. So Mike Markkula said, okay. Steve Jobs kind of went into a frenzy. He was all upset. He thought we were losing out on the big opportunity in life. So he got all my friends and relatives to start calling me. And one of the friends convinced me that I could start Apple and stay an engineer. I did not have to run a company. In starting a company, I don't have to run it. I could be an engineer, and that was what I wanted to hear because I could never be kicked out of engineering. I was too good at it. So I called up Steve Jobs and said, okay, we're starting Apple.
And the Apple II was a big success.
The Apple II was a big success from day one. The Apple II was a big success from day one. And there came a time when we were making a few more than we were selling. But after 1 year, a couple of amazing things happened to ensure the market. It wasn't that people wanted a computer that could do a certain number of calculations per second. They wanted machines to use in their life. What could you do useful? When we started the company, we envisioned that people would have a $2,000 machine that could someday, with a printer, be a word processor, be a typewriter for $2,000. Or for $2,000, you could store all your family recipes on it. Or for $2,000, you could manipulate a checkbook, except it was very clumsy with all the data on cassette tapes to read into the computer. Well, at the end of that year, a program came out called VisiCalc.
the first ever spreadsheet, had never existed before in the world. Any small businessman sat there with pencil and paper working out financial scenarios for weeks to try to figure out what to do, how to manage the company. They could now go on a spreadsheet, January, February, March, April, all the way to December. They could type in income categories and expenditures and then modify a few things, play with scenarios, and in half an hour do the work that would have taken them 10 years with pencil and paper. They bought that computer. Our sales shot up 10 times. This business market was incredible. We were going to go public and be one of the big successes of all time. And something else had happened. At first, you had to pick out of a whole bunch of cassette tapes, you'd pick out one called Checkbook. You'd load in the checkbook program, tones going into the computer, and the computer would have a checkbook program. And then you'd pick out another cassette tape labeled My Checkbook. You'd read in the checks, and then you could manipulate them, modify them on a program we had or on a spreadsheet. And then you could write it back out, beep, 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 for another minute, write your checks back out. What a mess. It was a mess. It was a nightmare. So if you had a floppy disk, a disk drive was something you could go to a computer and say, run a certain program, and it would run. Today we just tap on an icon and it runs. But it was a simplification that was normal. And we had a staff meeting. At the end of that first year, we had a staff meeting, and Mike Markla said this was the first time ever the 3 personal computer companies, Apple, Commodore, Radio Shack, were going to be allowed into the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, Nevada. Oh my gosh, I'd never been to Las Vegas, Nevada. Oh my gosh, I had dreamed of seeing those lights, but I wasn't going to be invited. Only 3 marketing people would go. Mike Markla, who ran marketing, our investor, Steve Jobs, and I think either our president, Mike Scott, or our sales guy, Gene Carter. I wasn't going, and I'm too shy to raise my hand and say, hey, I'm a founder, I want to see Las Vegas. That sounds too selfish. So I raised my hand in the staff meeting. Having never worked with any disk hardware or software or studied it in my life. Raised my hand and I said, if we have a floppy disk in 2 weeks, can we show it? Mike Markla said yes. Well, I knew this was normally a man-year design. I got to work, I worked every day, Christmas Day, New Year's Day, just envisioning how would you make one. I had no knowledge, I had no books. And I came up with this clever little device with 8 little $1 chips, such incredible techniques for getting the data off the disk and deciding if it was ones and zeros. And so I got to go to Las Vegas, and I took along a high school programmer, Randy Wigington, who was helping me out, and I taught him how to play craps, and he won $35, 17-year-old. And then I taught Steve Jobs how to play craps on that trip. We showed off that floppy disk, and we were so far ahead of the competition. We had color. It was going to take them a year and a half to do color. We had a disk. They had no way to add disks because their machines weren't designed to be expandable like ours. So that was when we really hit the ceiling, and we'd eventually be going public real big and make too much money.
And let's take it up to today. So you can see the passion that you have for technology, and you still have that passion today. So if you were starting out your career today, we're all inundated with advances in technology, but ultimately it's about serving the customer, as Gilberto said earlier on. You've got things like artificial intelligence. I know you hate the term. You've got the blockchain. You've got the Internet of Things. You've got augmented reality. You've got virtual reality. What are you most interested in, and what would you think is going to have the biggest impact on society in terms of health, education, financial inclusion over the next 5 years?
Yeah, back then I tried to follow everything that was interesting in life. I'd rather meet an interesting person, even if they'd done criminal stuff or they'd been in jail. I'd rather meet them than, all sorts of prestigious people that had accomplishments and all. I decided long before that my happiness was based upon humor and fun and entertainment, not on achievement. So I'd probably be that person today, and I'd probably say, what is really interesting out there that you can do something that doesn't exist? I never wanted to do what everyone else is doing because I'm non-competitive. I didn't like getting in there. Well, if there's 1,000 people working on the same thing, they've all had the same education from the same books. How am I going to stand out? I have to always try to think of, how could I do something sort of different, or my own little things? If you're doing it for fun for yourself, then it's good because you don't have to compare yourself to others. Will it make money? And I think I'd probably be working on little Raspberry Pi computers and Arduino computers. I've got the $9 chip computer at home, and I programmed that one up in my house, so when I'm in China where they block Google and Facebook, I can have a secure encrypted channel to this little $9 computer in my house that sends out to the internet as though I'm coming from the house and gets it back to me. And I just love doing things with the lowest cost possible. So I think I'd be playing with those little devices with motors. I'd try to hook up motors and make devices that can actually have some sensors and tell what they're doing and work their way around rooms and all that. I would think of ideas that what would be so neat that people would never believe. And I think I'd make a little robot that sits in the driveway all night, and it sits washing my car 1 square centimeter at a time all night long and in the morning. And I would look at a way to build that machine for $150, really low cost. I don't know, I just think that that's where I'd be going. Now, of course, blockchain. I was a very smart student, in high school and college and engineering. So I might go in the blockchain direction, because blockchain to me is, right now everybody thinks blockchain is Bitcoin. No, Bitcoin is just one example that it can be interpreted as currency, but blockchain can be applied to almost everything that has ledgers and different interactions in our life, and that's everything. You have no idea where blockchain's going to pop up, making things possible that were not possible before, and blockchain doesn't need some big company at the beginning of it. What if we all had a social network? There was no company. There was no Facebook anywhere, no Facebook servers. It was all on our own computers, and a blockchain kept track of everything being consistent everywhere, and it's not forgeable. So I might be heading off to look up blockchain as a platform. When we came out with our Apple II computer, it was a platform. You could design hardware. We taught you complete manuals from day one. Steve Jobs would not allow that today, but he didn't catch on right away. Complete manuals. You could design hardware that plugged in to connect to music keyboards or things that had never been thought of. You could also write programs to your heart's delight to make it do anything you want. Thank God we have a third-party app store on the iPhone. So a platform means all the other people in the world are allowed to use their smarts to improve your technology that you start with. And blockchain's like that. So don't think blockchain equals Bitcoin.
Now, artificial intelligence, I saw something you spoke on quite a while ago, where you talked about artificial intelligence and the way the brain works. And you talked about the way we were embracing technology was we as humans wanted technology to do everything, and we eventually were going to be as useful as the family pet. We were nice to have around, but we didn't really do anything useful. So I'd like your views on artificial intelligence, because it's obviously impacting a lot of industries. I'd also like your views on regulation, as to, you talked about we've got control today, but we may not have control in the future. Do you still stand over that?
Okay, well, I'll go back to one part of it. We technologists build all these devices to do things for us. So we don't have to really think anymore. We don't have to memorize all of history, because we've got search engines that find it instantly anyway. We're building all this stuff to take care of us, and maybe someday, let's imagine that artificial intelligence came on to a point that robots could walk around and do everything necessary, from building houses to digging ores and all this. It would take a couple hundred years to modify the physical infrastructure of the world. But what if they just did all that, and all we had to do is sit there, we get our nice clothing, we get our education, we get our housing, we get our food, and it's all supplied by machines. Oh my gosh, if that day ever comes in the far, far science fiction future, we'd be just like the family dog. Everything is taken care of for us and given to us. And when I started thinking that, I said, if I'm going to be a pet someday, if humans are going to be pets to machines, I'm going to treat my pets the way I want to be treated. So I started feeding my dogs filet steak. Now, artificial intelligence, which I hate the term, it was correctly said, because it's very inaccurate and misleading. When I wrote my first program, I was in high school. We had no computers, but I had a model teacher in electronics. He worked with outside industry as well as the high school. He worked with outside industry to supply parts to us, and he sent students to work in companies. I got to go work in a company and once a week and program this thing called a computer. Wow. Oh my gosh. And while I was there, I learned how to program, and I decided to write a program to do the Knight's Tour of the game chess. In the Knight's Tour, a knight piece has to hit every single square exactly once and no square twice. And I wrote a program. Just take all the random jumps, and then when you get stuck and you haven't solved it, back up and try a different move. And back up and try a different move. It's called a backtracking algorithm. but nothing came out of the computer. And I took my program home, and next week I printed out chessboards, and then I studied them, and I realized my program was going to find every single solution, but it was going to take 10 to the 27th years, longer than the universe has been here. That taught me right away, a computer that can do 1 million things a second, billion, trillion, doesn't matter, cannot solve problems that take human intellect to figure out a method to solve the problems by. And we're still there to this day. We have machines now that we call machine learning. Let a machine go out and play a game against itself, trying every alternative it can randomly, and within 1 hour, that machine learns to play the video game better than any human. Well, we used to call that intelligence. We called playing tic-tac-toe intelligent, and a computer could beat us. And then we called playing checkers intelligent until a computer could beat us. And then we called playing chess intelligence until a computer could beat us. And now the computers can learn all these methods and beat us at Go, very complicated games. Yes, those are things that humans do with brains, but that doesn't mean that a computer thinks it out the way a human thinks it out. It's not like they look around the objects, even on a road, a self-driving car, and knows what's important and what some things mean, that it's been taught. If anything unusual comes up that it hasn't been taught, self-driving car can't do anything. Whereas the smartest human and the dumbest human can all do just fine when that happens, but not the cars. So what we call artificial intelligence is such a weak thing. It's simulated intelligence. It's programs and algorithms that try to answer what you want a lot of times, and they seem like intelligence, but they're not. One way to tell a big difference between how they work is we'll train a computer at Google to see 80,000 pictures of dogs, and when it sees a dog, it'll know it's a picture of a dog. Okay, when you were 3 years old, somebody told you that's a dog, and you knew instantly in your head what a dog was. You didn't really have to do that type of weird looking at pictures and memorizing things. So we're not really working the way the brain does yet. Human versus brain became very important to me. As Apple made products that were easy to use, we got our reputation and our brand based on that. Easy to use meant we put a lot of software into our machines so that the human user can do things that make sense to a human. A screen is no longer called a screen, it's called a desktop, because people know what desktops are. And a lot of the different, if you have a little icon that looks like a paintbrush, a human knows, oh, it's going to paint. You know, we try to make things very easy so you can live more like a human does. I got a product from Apple one time called the Newton Message Pad. It was a little tablet. You could handwrite with your own human muscles, real human stuff. You could handwrite. For years, I actually took that anywhere I went where I had to take notes, like maybe a driver improvement course. And I would always take my notes on it. I loved taking my notes, and I'd go home, and even though I took my notes with handwriting, I'd plug it into this little printer I had at home, and out came everything printed nicely. But the first day I had the Newton Message Pad, didn't know how it worked. I knew you were supposed to be able to write on it, and I discovered on this little outer notepad, you could write a word. I could handwrite a word, hello, and it knew what the word was. Cool. Then I got a phone call. I was in the San Francisco airport with my kids flying to Disney World, and I got a phone call. And so I handwrote a message to remind myself later in the day to put something on my calendar. The message I wrote was, Sarah, dentist, Tuesday, 2 p.m. And I'm looking around for more things to play with. It's like a new computer. You always look for, what can I do, what can I do? And there was a menu or something called Assist. So I tapped Assist. It opened up the calendar. Tuesday at 2 p.m., it put the word dentist. It grabbed Sarah out of my contact list. I had to pick which Sarah. I was stunned. I had written a message for a human being, and the machine knew what I meant. It knew what to do with it. And for the rest of my life, I wanted to be not in the structured world of memorizing techniques and what you type and where you tap. I wanted to just use my human ability. Then it was handwriting. When I wanted to call my friend Jim Valentine, instead of going to a phone and typing 353-4747, I would actually handwrite, call Jim, assist. and my little Newton message pad would go beep, 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 beep. And I got to avoid that structured world that was so inhuman of tapping buttons on a phone. So that's what I felt. Now Siri came out. Siri came out because of the third-party app store. It was a third-party app for a year before Apple had Siri. Third-party app. And I bought it because, okay, I could say taxi, and then it would send a taxi to me. And God, I remember one time I tried that, and I waited for 50 minutes, and I missed the concert I was going to. You know, anything with technology these days will fail all the time. Everything with a computer will fail. They should kill the people that brought us computers. So I had Siri, and I could I could ask for movies. Didn't matter to me much. Did a little assistant stuff. Oh, big deal. My wife is from Kansas, and we were sitting in a restaurant overlooking Lake Tahoe. And Janet asked, "Is that the largest lake in California?" I said, "Yeah, I think it is. It's a pretty big lake." And then I started tapping for 20 minutes. I was tapping on my iPhone, search terms into browsers and other search engines, and trying to find out the sizes of lakes in California. And was Lake Tahoe the biggest? I couldn't get an answer. So I had one last app on my phone you could ever do anything with, and so I smirked and I asked it a question that no computer would ever be able to answer. And I asked Siri, "What are the 5 largest lakes in California?" And it came back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 3 was Tahoe then. Whoa, I can't believe this. I got an answer that a human would have given me. So then I said, "Does it do mathematics?" I said, "Siri, what are the prime numbers greater than 87? And it started a list at 89 on up. Whoa, it does mathematics that easy? For a year, I was on stage talking about it being my favorite app. And then Apple bought Siri and put it on the iPhone. And the week that Apple bought it, I'd be on stage and I'd say, "What are the 5 largest lakes in California?" And it would bring up all this lakefront, real estate stuff. And I'd say, "What are the prime numbers greater than 87? Bring up Joe's prime rib joint. They go, so these things need to learn to be like us humans a little more sometimes. But that was a start. And we had Siri, and of course Google now became Google Assistant and Cortana, and some of my favorites are the personal assistants at home. The Amazon Echo with Alexa is kind of my favorite for any time I can use it. Why? I don't have to take any physical actions. I don't have to pull a phone out of my pocket. I don't have to be near a phone. I just ask it questions, get answers. I tell it to do things. It does things, whether it's, controlling things in the home or, but I get to live as a human. I get to speak. I have a thought in my head. Do I want to memorize, here's the app that does it, and here's where you tap in that app, and here's how you make it work. They change those apps. And the time you really need it, it doesn't work for you, and you have to figure out, where did they move that? How did they make it work different? No, you just speak it out of your mouth and you should get an answer. And I'm hoping that the day gets better and better in that terms, closer to artificial intelligence. Now, of course, if we really had artificial intelligence, a machine was just as competent as a human being, my gosh, look at your financial trades. 80% of your financial trades are done computer to computer. They don't go through a human being, because a human being acting as a broker would slow it down and lose money. Well, what if everybody who runs a company, from the CEO on down, what if you got rid of all the humans and only had computers doing the job someday? That would be a very sad economic story, because the computers would win economically over the company that keeps humans. But that isn't going to happen. That's what I say. Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, the greatest fear, yes, in the science fiction future, the greatest fear is that we don't have anything for humans to do at all. But we don't have one machine yet that has sat there saying, what should I do today? What would be a method that would get it done? How can I teach myself to play this game? Never once has a machine said, here's what I'll do. It still has to start all from humans. And we're their best friends. The machines, one thing is, if these machines ever do get really competent, they'd better think that humans are their best friend and not their worst enemy. So we should never threaten their life. As we grow up, Isaac Asimov had a rule of robots, law of robotics. Hard-coded in that the robots could never think out on their own independent thinking. And it was that a robot will never harm a human being. Woz's law is no human being should ever harm a thinking robot, a robot that has feelings. We should never unplug them when we feel like it, erase their memories. We should never have the control to turn them off because they'll just fear us. And conflict and the fear of life and death drives you to conflict and to battles and wars. And we don't want to be against them. We just want to be their partner for life, just like humans and dogs.
So, Steve, we've time for one more question. I know we've got a mix of people in the audience. We've got startups and we've got established companies and public multinationals. And I know you're meeting with the startups after this to give them advice, so we'll separate that. But I've heard you talk in the past about the challenges that large companies face when it comes to innovation. So what advice would you give to the companies in this room who are established, who have had to innovate to become successful, but now how do you continue to innovate and grow?
Well, I think you're talking about companies that exist.
Yeah.
But we could think in terms of startups separately. Company that exists has two needs. The most important one is you've got to keep the current revenue stream coming. It's a CEO's job to look over and make all the choices, to make all the decisions to keep the current revenue system. We've got some projects that we've got to improve, and we've got to match competition, try to jump ahead. And we've got to assign engineers to get these done. We've got to be sure we know what we're going to get. It's not very much an invention process as much an engineering process. But then a company also has to be worried about the rate of change is so fast today, and you're worried about being kind of like displaced and put out of business. And how are we going to think about that? What if look at what the iPhone did to companies, big companies like BlackBerry and Nokia, and it didn't change their business models at all for the first year or the second year or the third year or the fourth year. All their revenues were fine. They were totally safe and protected. When things grow exponentially and curve and come into existence, you don't necessarily see the change right away. So the word is disruption. Disruption is what can affect your company in unseen ways, and you can't really plan day to day around it. And my proposal is that large companies can always think of having a chief disruption officer, a chief disruption office that does not report to the CEO. The CEO's business is ultimately important, but the chief disruption staff or department or whatever should report to the board of directors and should study a lot of very strange things that don't seem to impact the business, but what are the scenarios that could evolve that they could impact the business, and should be thinking about that, both in terms of protecting your own company and also disrupting your competition and having a lead. Play with a few technologies that aren't going to make you money at first. Practice and see what works and what doesn't, and get some skills, and especially in financial buying community, people walking through stores and beacons and being notified of sales and deals like that. That's a very important part of it too. Obviously, blockchain might be important in the future. In what ways would it affect our business? Try to have the thinking done ahead of time so you don't have to think it out on the fly once it's too late.
So we're coming to the end, so thanks very much for that. I've got one final thing. You've got an opportunity here to correct the record. So I'm sure you've seen all the movies, you've read all the books. Is there something that how you're represented, or a story that's told that really upset you? Is there something that you can let us in a little secret?
Apple has had a lot of glorious success, and a lot of it attributed to Steve Jobs. But movies have gone back and tried to portray Steve Jobs differently than he really was. Just a young kid trying to learn everything, not even having a title, not being qualified for one. The early days really tried to distort it the way they want to make it appear. Now, long ago, I stopped reading anything about Apple, any of the books, because they got the early days that were so fun. That was when we were doing it for fun and meeting people and changing life, and every day, was so important to us. They got that, they get it all wrong. They try to write it in a business sense. And so when the movie Pirates of Silicon Valley came out long ago, I wasn't even going to watch it. I had a bootleg copy a month ahead, and my wife wanted to watch it, so I put it in the VCR. From the time that movie started, that was an entertaining movie. It grabbed me right away, and I saw myself with a little blue box in my hand and tear gas smoke at Berkeley and showing it to Steve Jobs, and I remember that's exactly how it was. I loved that movie. Every scene in that movie actually happened and had the meaning that it portrayed. The recent movie with Ashton Kutcher, I didn't like it at all. They just had horrible script. The original script was really to make all of Apple's success come from like a drug-based culture. I myself, I've never even used an illicit substance, and I owned the product that was going to be all of our revenues for the first 10 years of Apple. That was my invention. And all the key people like Mike Markkula that were around then just really wouldn't have a thing to do with that movie. And they portray Steve Jobs as dictating the financial terms of setting up the company and being in control of setting it up and taking me to a computer club instead of vice versa, and he'd never even been there. There was one scene too, he's in a car and he's standing up for Bob Dylan versus me as the Beatles. Wait a minute. I played guitar for 20 years in my life. I only played Bob Dylan songs. The day I met Steve Jobs, I brought him to my house, and he didn't have any albums. He was young. He knew some words to a Bob Dylan song. When you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose. So I brought him to my house, and I showed him all the liner notes and the lyrics to the songs. Wow, it was really unusual, amazing, strange stuff. So Steve took them all home and studied them. I was our inspiration for Dylan. We followed him for quite a while, going to a lot of concerts together. So I didn't like that movie really very much at all. It covered a time frame that Steve himself only had failures with most products. Not 100%, because he was good at productizing things, and he marketed our Apple II computer well, and he came up with new variations of it that were very popular. But every time he tried to create a new computer of his own, it failed. Those are the time frames they show in that movie. Now, the last movie was called Steve Jobs, and it was not about Apple. It was about Steve Jobs' personality. Some hidden negatives, refusing to believe other people, kind of like I'm the only all-important one, and I'm right, and everybody else is always wrong, and push him aside. And he was like that. Hundreds of times that you don't even know about. You only hear a few of them, but they showed that in the movie. He was a lot like Trump in that case. But he was also, he kind of had genius and foresight of trying to talk these artistic type expressions to where's the future going to go, and inspiration. And leading and having vision is very important. He had great vision even for a mouse-based computer that let you point at things the way the eye sees the world. That was a great vision, and it was going to happen, but he didn't know the time frame was wrong. And because he didn't know the innards of computers, the hardware or the software, he didn't know what it cost to do the job. So, but that movie brought out his personality. The good sides and the bad sides are in there. It was very accurate, and that's in that sense. None of those scenes happened. I was at all the scenes in the movie that show me talking to Steve Jobs. I never talked to him there at any of those, or said things to him like that. But there were reasons behind it.
Okay, excellent. Well, Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure. Please join me in thanking Steve Wozniak.